This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's the 28th, and we're almost out of February. Last week I talked to you about Farmer City and its historical journal, Mirror, and its attributes. It's in flatland and doesn't have mountains or artifacts to record, but it has a lot of interesting history. And when you get into a situation where there's not a lot of drama, then the microclimates, the micro events, the micro details get to be interesting. And some of those details are missed by people who go from monumental event to another monumental event and think they can move past little towns because they've seen all those before. But the journal also covered several different stages of history. And today I want to say that there are other communities around here we've talked about, like Danville has a history. It had salt found by the Indians and early settlement and a geology that involves fault lines, which allowed the accumulation of a Carboniferous era vegetation that was compressed into coal. So it had to be mined, and that invited miners from places like Kentucky and Tennessee. They came, and they were also interested in providing food for the pit ponies and for people, and they would have 5-acre lots to do that. Then came the strip miners, and they didn't need deep miners anymore. So those little 5-acre lots became other industries. And so there's a history there, and there are people who record that, and they put up a museum. And there's usually 2 or 3 people around town who collect that sort of history. Go to Paxton, it's the same. Dr. Sau was an optometrist, and he spent a lot of his life recording the Scandinavian history, the rather fancy houses on their State Street, and with widow's walks up in the sky so that you could see if your husband was coming home. And in Champaign, it was different. You had a reason for coming here was a cemetery. Seminary was here, and there was a battle at the state, and Champaign got the first industrial university here using that vacated seminary building. So different reasons why these people come together. Well, I'm going to take you to a similar, but a town that has features that make it rather historic. And it's in Wisconsin. At one stage, we were doing reading the landscape course at Parkland College, and an prof named Jim Zanzi came and enjoyed doing that. And so he suggested that we do something like Artists in the Landscape with the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. So we used their vehicles and took mainly seniors and staff people on a tour of Illinois, Iowa, Michigan. We were in Wisconsin too. We tried downstate Illinois, but it was just too hot and muggy and too many mosquitoes. So the attention span was very small. So we concentrated some on Wisconsin, and we had a third party, Lisa Stone, who had been working in communities and counties in Wisconsin looking for artists that were doing things independently, often untrained artists, but unique artists. And she helped to put together a book which outlined some of this, and some of you might like to know about that book. So we'll do another program which will do an overhaul of that. But in the process, we went to Mineral Point, where Jim Sansi now lives, retired from the School of the Art Institute, where he was head of the department at the time. A photographer, a sculptor, and a historian, and museum person. So Mineral Point is kind of an interesting place for him. Mineral Point has a background history we should introduce you to. First, you have glaciation, and this is in the unglaciated part of Wisconsin. This is where for some reason or other, the glaciers went around and left this corner of southwest Wisconsin and northwest Illinois free of glaciation as such, but not free of volumes of water being held back by moraines that would then burst and create canyons and erosion ditches that create a lot of different botanical backgrounds. Well, some of that area had been water-worn before there was a change of the glacial era came down and went back, but the unglaciated area was not free of water-worn erosion, and so the Indians knew about this, and the French rediscovered northern Illinois and Wisconsin, and so the French came in probably in the 1630s, and they recognized that there were minerals there, and they, as French people, owned that territory until there was a battle with the English, and it was somewhat complex. Some of the Indians sided with the English, some of the Indians sided with the French, but eventually England was in charge. That brought early settlers, but it wasn't exactly calm. The independence came in something like 1776, I think, and so there was a battle about taxes with the English, and then later, and I think 1812, there was another battle, and I remember the White House being in danger, and the English lost that one too. The native population were being escorted west in dribs and drabs, and people were taking over. And Mineral Point started in about 1827, and probably for 150 years before that. French people were here and there, and they recognized that there was lead at the surface, and that's very unusual. Usually you have to remove overburden in order to get to the minerals. So once established, the English got miners came in. Some of them had been working on the East Coast, but this was attractive. It was not only lead, it was zinc and copper, and at the surface. So this is why the Wisconsin people are known as Badgers, because the early settlers were in this unglaciated area with quite considerable minerals. Mineral Point started out to be coordinated in 1827. That was still when the territory of Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and was labeled as Michigan Territory. It was a territory. So Mineral Point was historically established on its own before there was a state. In 1836, I think it was, there was a spin-off, and a lot of Illinois became Wisconsin, and Wisconsin became a state. So some of this organization went on at Mineral Point because it was a place that was established and other places were not. There was mining. Sometimes some of the miners went deeper than the surface, and some of them almost lived in the mine just so they wouldn't lose their sight. It happened, and so there was not only a town that serves the mining area, or it's a drainage basin that runs eventually into the Mississippi. Between moraines and kettles, the terrain further north has more lakes and more moraines, and it's more rugged. Sometimes the agriculture is on the surface rather than on the flat land between the moraines. Well, so to some extent it could be agriculture, but mainly it was a region of mining. And the font of strength was in Mineral Point. The minerals had to be processed, so you had entrepreneurs that established industries that would break down the material you get out. When you get copper or zinc or whatever, it's often in overburden, so you need to crush it and perhaps wash it in order to liberate the minerals. So there were operators that would do that. So Mineral Point became somewhat commercial. And when the miners came, the population went up quickly. And a lot of the miners were Welsh because they had been used to mining in the British Isles and knew how to do it. And so one street that there's opposite a hill that was loaded with, it wasn't a moraine, it was unglaciated. So it was a hill that was rewarding for mining. And so there was a lineup of uh, houses that were made from country rock and very small. I think the miners must have been short because the roofs are short. You almost have to, if you're a tall person and I'm 6'3", you have to lean down some places, especially when you go through doors. So these places were generally referred to as Pendavas, and later there would be restoration. But for the period of mining when it was active, there was this row of houses and to a stream that went through these hills. This is the water-worn streams that washed the minerals to the surface. So at the end of one of these streams, there was a brewery, and there were hotels and lots of work on the hill. And the term shake rag was given to the street because the wives would, when mealtime came, the miners were close enough to return home, and the wife would shake a rag to indicate that it was mealtime. It's so you have history of lead, but lead didn't last forever. And when lead was found in California and gold was found in California, people left. And so Mineral Point has not been a town that has increased in population. It's remained at about 2,500 for a long time and keeps losing a little bit. The secondary mineral was zinc. So some people got involved with zinc. There was a need for taking your product to Joliet to refractory furnaces that melted down the minerals. Places like Galena would do the same sort of thing. But if you were going to take your minerals by horse and cart or by oxen, it was a long trip. So eventually there was a network of railroad beds, and those railroad beds reached right up to Mineral Point, and Mineral Point was a terminus for one. So there were places for loading and there were places for processing and places for transport and early organizations. You were dealing with lumber for wooden houses that were worked with country stone and limestone. There were springs here and there that gave the opportunity for the like of a brewery. There was a need for churches, early churches that came in the 30s, 40s. And if you walk around Mineral Point, you enjoy looking at different houses with different backgrounds, Victorian or Italianate or mixed breeds, sometimes with different features from different architectural backgrounds. Some of them very simple, early buildings. And you have to know that this Mineral Point had a fair opinion of itself, even though it was breaking down. The miners had gone. Buildings were still there, and some people got very interested in preserving some of these buildings. Uh, they so looking at the how you do history, an iconic house all of a sudden was going to be demolished. So people got together and they asked the owners if they could preserve the building as a historic site. So you have the first elements of a historic museum, but that wasn't the all of it. The contract had been let. So they had to not only buy the land or be given the land, I think it was 10 or so acres, but they had to pay off the contractor. They did that, and they saved the building, and it had been a store, if I remember rightly, a fairly prominent Grundy family, and so it became the Historical Society and the Historical Society Museum. So then you have little publications like the Mirror at Farmer City, and people who cared, and some of the early settlement people became the judges and the first governors of Wisconsin. Judge Dodd was a leader and born and bred in Mineral Point. He went to school there, but he was appointed to various positions. He went to school to become a lawyer and eventually was appointed judge in the Chicago area and lived in Winnetka. But he always had a foot in his hometown of Mineral Point. He was eventually the first governor. The Mineral Point was early, 1827. The state was not created till 36, and he became its first governor. And up the road a little bit is Dodgeville, and after the family name, and the state seat was moved from early work with Mineral Point to Dodgeville. So today you can go to Dodgeville. There were all sorts of people that came. There were entrepreneurs, there were religious people, there were railroad people, there were miners. And if you go to Mineral Point, you can have a riotous time just taking their guided tour. It doesn't have to be guided. They have a book. The judge who came later is a guy named Fiedler, and he and others promoted the restoration, especially of the Pendarvis area, which is where the Shake Rag street of houses was. And so they have a trail guide to that with explanations, and that becomes very interesting. It's very helpful to have information. I've been dealing with a gallery in Australia, and they have been begging for storylines that go with prints, and the same goes here. Stories are helpful, and people know the players, and so you can walk onto the hill and see where the Badgers were mining, the Welsh people who were mining. You can see the terminal of the railroad line. It has been in recent years kind of washed out. It was closed out some time ago, and the railroad beds often followed the streams, and so the rail bed has become a rail trail. And differently from other states, Wisconsin is faced with a cold winter, so uh, snowmobiles and other vehicles are allowed to use the bicycle trails. I assume there's lots of laws associated with uh, not going too fast and not destroying the place for hikers and bikers. But it takes you down the river, which is kind of meandering and fairly natural. Uh, so I want to remind you that in your little burg, whether it's a city block or a river or a lake, do things that are interesting. This Mineral Point provided the first Oddfellows building. And the Oddfellows were an insurance company. If your husband was going to be working with horses and you got kicked in the stomach with a horse, then you were out of it, and the wife might be left with 8 children. So there were a series of secret societies that had their own rules, and you could belong, but they were separate. So the modern woodsman would be separate from the Indians, and there's also some of the first museums associated with some of these groups. So there's a neat little house with, which in its day probably had a ballroom and for official events and rooms about it, and located on a hillside. There are more rough and tough houses near Pendavis or near to the railroad. There are people who were gentlemen who had law degrees and finance, and they got into the act of selling land and became wealthy. And so their houses represent that. If you walk down Main Street, it hasn't been replaced. So eventually they needed zoning, and so that the interesting buildings didn't disappear. And in actual fact, they are very valuable as tourist attractions, and the tourists drop money to be involved in a place like this one. The first Oddfellows building, I think, depends on people dropping support money and providing services, and not always easy. There's cemeteries, and the cemeteries tell history, and prominent people are there, and you can get to know that sometimes when prominent people are buried in a cemetery and somebody comes along 100 years later and decides it should be a parking lot and puts the grave heads to the side, then that's not a very friendly thing. But cemeteries do to get closed. In Champaign-Urbana, we have a Busey Cemetery on University, which was closed in 1903, something like that. And as you walk through, it's a park, but you can see the rolling nature of where graves were. And there's somewhere in there's a couple of Indian graves, and we don't know where they are, but if anyone digs there, they can dig up graves. And if they do that, they have to be involved with the coroner, and bones have to be stored in places like the university. So uh, little old cemeteries which are surrounded by 2 or 3 trees because you can't plow them tell stories, and that is so at Mineral Point. There are still highways that go through, so you have to warn people that if they're wandering around with their head in the air looking at buildings, they also are in a modern era when there's traffic to be concerned. There was usually 2 or 3 people that get together. One of them is, I think, Norton. There's Hellman, a couple of people who've done a lot to restore the Shake Rag area and to create a historic district. You see the same sort of thing happening here. Market Street is actually part of a historic district. And that means that the city is trying to keep some of the buildings in Market Street intact. Well, Mineral Point was doing that, and it was first in the state and first in the country often. They sent people off to World War, to the Civil War, to World War I and World War II, and so there's military history. Some of these places had forts, and early times it was necessary because the Indians were rather astute at guerrilla tactics, and fought helped to prevent that. In the general area, there are other people who start to do interesting things. I went to a memorial for one of the developers and stayed in a farmhouse, which has become a historic site. The husband did a lot of sculpted pieces, and they're in the yard. It's the sort of thing where where a car going past all of a sudden will stop and back up because what the devil was that? And some of these sculpted pieces may have political attributes. Some of them are just fun and primitive art to some extent. But these are the farmers that are near to Mineral Point, and the wife in one case was a salesperson for equipment, and she would walk for miles to get to farmers to sell equipment, and she was very successful. So some of the support for her husband's art work was from her well-known work around. I would encourage you, whether it's a modern situation, to just think about it. We have, for instance, Lake Park has a little prairie, just to put the prairie together and announce it and let people have a trail through it and see it utilized and take out the invasive weeds. That's making a community effort and community statement. And it also gives a certain introduction to caring, to different groups that might be very different in their political style, being able to talk to each other and share in other things. There are always some things that are the same for both people. You don't have to be arguing if you concentrate on the things that are co-equal. Even roadsides, and we have one roadside at Rantoul that goes to Paxton, 10 miles. It has an old road there, and we really need people to get together, people that are established, people who are not established, to make a statement that goes to the Department of Transportation, which owns much of the territory, to the Department of Natural Resources. And the same sort of thing happens in Mineral Point, and Mineral Point has been an example for other states, other places, other countries to preserve some of the dignity of their history. If you go to Europe, you go to England, you do find some of these things preserved. Sometimes it's just a feature of a building. English people tend to name their pubs. And so in Mineral Point, there's a dog, which is the symbol for the store that was the store for the community. And other places, it might be an Indian. You don't necessarily do that these days, but that was part of the giving character to the walkways. The walkways early were mud, then they were board, then they would be something else. The little springs indicate that there was probably limestone underneath, and so many of these buildings are limestone or dolomite in the rock formation. And when those buildings are built, they've got to be careful to not put them on top of a place where there is a spring, and where sometimes, surprising to people, the building slips into a hole. The water worn through the limestone has created a sink, and you have to be a little careful about where you build and how you build. And you have to know an era of horses. So somebody might have a Clydesdale or a Percheron horse team, and the horses get used to being specimens. They can be very friendly. They can also be dangerous. So don't assume that you can do anything with a horse. But they're sort of wild animals too, but they can be very friendly, and you have to feed them. It's costly to feed them, so there has to be agriculture. And there has to be places where people could communicate. So theaters, so Mineral Point restored their old theater, and they probably have to have a bigger, better, more modern theater, but the old one is still there. And the streets are not designed on the square. They fit into the landscape. And there has to be sporting. So do you put in a big arena? Probably not. If you're going to communicate with other high schools, you may have to have an arena that's big enough to cater for a few teams. But you don't have to have an arena that brings in the Chicago team that wants to be doing a dry run for their later efforts. And sometimes you see that sort of happening. There's some entrepreneurship in this. I can remember going to Australia at one stage, and there is a commercially established theme park that's based on a huge banana, and it is sad in a way to go there and to look for a koala in a park nearby, and it just irritates some people, especially historians, when some of your territory is imposed on by the entrance corridor being too loud, too narrow, too cheap, and lacking the quality that you would like to have. It's better to have that farmer with the number of different sculpted pieces nearby. You need perhaps a church with a group of nuns that respect some of the minerals, and you need people who perhaps can act a little more like people of the past, dressed up as a miner or dressed up as, and storytelling is, it's just, there's a need for planning that helps to develop these sort of things and maintain them. It's a little slower life, so we have to excuse people for not having a huge computerized industry. So it's your choice in life to some extent. Some of the people who are the leaders in this sort of community are people who contribute a lot of their lives to the future of generations that might want to continue in this community and in other communities that they go to. I'm going to change a little right now because I've this week been working on tidying up my office, and one of the things that I have is the crockery to the southern tea rooms. And the southern tea rooms were on Campus Town. They were just on the corner of Green and Wright. If you think a little bit, that's within eyesight of the alma mater and the Union, and it was Campus Town, and right, the second building on the northwest corner of Green Street after you leave Wright Street, there was a huge fraternity building, and it was higher than the three-story building next door, which was called Follett's. And Follett's has been remodeled in modern style. So there are some people who really regret that because the original building had character. It might not have had the suave of sails and things like that, but it was an interesting building. On the west side of the fraternity was a theater, and the theater was attractive because it had a well, and the water from the aquifer was cold, and so there was an air exchange, so you could cool the air that was going to the theater. It's long since been replaced by air conditioners, but it was historic. There was an open drainage ditch, which was called the Boneyard. and it had character. Much of it has been uh, covered over and runs through pipes, but it gave character. The university had a natural history building. It wasn't the natural history building, it was an adjunct for the natural history building. So it had a bunch of biologists there, and they had prairie chickens. And you could go watch the prairie chickens, and if they were feeling so, they would do a dance for you. And there were uh, other birds and two ponds. And two ponds are hard to keep in maintenance. But these little things make a town interesting. If you go to the corner of Sixth and Green, there was a pharmacy. Now it's been replaced by a 9-story building. I can't believe it's huge, but slowly the old community is losing some of its character. But even so, you can retain some of that character. In Chicago, there is an old area north of town which missed the fire of Chicago, and it's retained its character despite a lot of development around it. So it still gives you a feeling for history and a story of the development. And it too has a river that fed into the Lake Michigan, but there was so much sewage going into Lake Michigan that the river was moved so it eventually dropped into the Mississippi. So then the Mississippi gets the sewage. But somebody has to think about these things, and we have to respect planners who look at that and look at traffic. It's not going to be good in Mineral Point if you're going to walk across a highway that's dangerous. It takes away the atmosphere. If you're going to have people be theatrical, then they have to have that sort of atmosphere and attitude. And the libraries have to be the same. They have to have character. And the visitor center should not be bold and I was going to say it has to be altruistic in a historic manner. If you can recreate some towns are considerably recreated, especially if you go to Charleston, Carolina, you're not allowed to take down old storefronts. You can do what you like with the internals and you can modernize them, but the town has to look like it was Charleston in Civil War days. And there are ordinances. Some of them are federal, some of them are encouraged by grants. So if the federal government feels like it has to keep Virginia, Richmond, or other places reasonably intact as historical sites, then they can provide grant money that encourages that process. And, uh, and there are people who adjudicate just the same way as you have a national science organization and scientists judge each other and give each other grant money, then so does historical people and humanitarians that there, and you have a right to ask for that opportunity. You know, you've paid taxes, other people have paid taxes, and you have the right to speak up. Often you do have to speak up, and you have to have track record. Just this week, Allerton Park is asking for live-in artists to be there in wintertime, about 6 weeks over the winter, because people have gotten used to coming and visiting the house, and there are people who register to sell artwork and crafts, and so then you have to think about what you might be able to do to attract a crowd. This year, there were lots of lights, and you walked through the lights, and that was an interesting thing to do. But 1 year ahead almost, people are putting in for grantsmanship to do that job next year. Could it be a local person? Could it be a national or international invitee? It's probably not big enough for an international person, but this is a place where beginning artists can get an idea of what they might do as a come on to tourists. And the tourists are often not crass. They're not going to blink and go through Monticello without stopping and asking, what's your story? What brought you here? Is it the Sangamon River? Who bought Allerton Park? It was Sam Allerton, who was selling food to the Union Army and had enough money to buy land in different places, which land in this case given to John Allerton, who eventually gave it to the university. So there's little pieces of history there. There's wonderful wildlife in little places like Lodge Park and Shady Rest, and in Allerton itself. There are trails. There are the trails between Danville and Decatur and Champaign-Urbana in the middle, and Paxton and Bloomington and Arcola, that not only allow for recreation, but they also allow for preservation and interpretation. So we need people who can look at a situation and emphasize in almost a cartoon manner what it is. It might be that like Billy Jackson, who does a very accurate rendering, even though in watercolors or oils, almost photographic, but you can see interpretation in there. You might even see Billy Jackson's image of himself in amongst the people at a market or something like that. You can see people who are quite abstract. Glenn Bradshaw did abstract. He got different colors of tissue and put them down on a flat plane, but in the long run, it would be the imagery would be hung on a wall, and you can imagine the clouds coming in. You can imagine a road, and so that's very clever artwork. Or you might be like George Foster, who used to play violin at Southern tea rooms. I didn't say so, but when I was writing my provenance, the fraternity went broke in the 30s depression, and the Dallenbar family bought, and Mrs. Dallenbar's mother and aunt came from Lebanon, Tennessee, and they were prepared to put in a restaurant. And At that time, there was not a situation in the union that would allow for the board of trustees to meet. So they met in the Southern Tea Rooms, which was very elegant. It had a grand piano and a cat and a, a bird in a cage and George Foster playing the violin when he was a student. Later, he was a professor. That his sketch work was quite different from uh, Bradshaw's or Billy Jackson's. He was more a linear person, and people used to sit on the veranda of that big building and watch the parade go by. The parade used to go through campus town. And these were people who were close to the university. Some of them were administering the union or parts of the union. Some were theatrical people, costumiers that worked with credit before there was a credit center, heads of department of theater, home economics people who were writing texts, people who were English as a second language. So these people that found themselves in close proximity to the university had in their own right character and attracted people to come visit, students to come visit. Daisy Baines, Mrs. Dallenbar's mother, used to commune with the arts a lot. She had a long cigarette holder with a cigarette, and this was a Charleston era, perhaps, and students enjoyed her, and she enjoyed them, and she painted, and there was a painting in the foyer, and a huge stairwell that went up to the restrooms on the second floor. When the Board of Trustees eventually got facilities in the union, they, Mrs. Smith, the aunt, who was the proprietor, went around and created 17 apartments, and they were very, very interesting. And they were lived in by these people that I'm talking about. And they would have coffee across the road in the bank that went bankrupt in the Depression, and they all knew each other, and that happens modern day too. But it was particularly interesting then, and unfortunately, the Dallenbar family was on its way to Mexico, where they had a retreat in Cancun or somewhere like that, and they got as far as Texas, and they got the message that the McDonald's wanted to buy the building. So they turned around and come back. And so today the building is down, and some of the materials have gone to places like Packer. But it was a place of character right on campus. It had a little front lawn. It has roses. In the flower children age, people would try to pick the roses, but they were rather thorny and they didn't pick very easily. So we could always tell when they were there. I used to live there for a while, and we had to all get out and go. So we still know each other, for many years, and that's part of our history and the future. So I'm thinking we're getting near to the end. I ended a little short last week, but these things happen. I didn't take a note of the time on the clock, so I was guessing. But doing this is almost something of the same thing. You have WEFT next door. We're doing things remote. We know each other. And so yesterday afternoon, I was walking around and seeing buildings and places. The snow is still drying out, but there's character here, and there's history here, and there should be little trails. And there's the planning people do have a trail guide, and Lakeman can take a group of people around. And there's a historic museum, a cattle bank, and you should get involved in some of these things. I think it's time. This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And thank you to WEFT and to Banner Public Television, which records these slides. Just last week, we saw that our image was a little fuzzy. It was the camera needed a cleaning. So it's a little bit of maintenance, a little bit of getting to a lot of music and wonder. So do well. Now it's warmer. Think about spring. Go over to Danville and see the skunk cabbage coming out of the snow in a seep. It was really marvelous to find some of these traditional plants.